How important is the information system to the valuation of a company? At Ultra, we're seeing an increasing number of firms implement new information systems as part of a growth and exit strategy. So how should we evaluate the information system and its impact on value? So what's needed when evaluating a business process? Let's look at ways to understand and evaluate an information system and its business processes. Your first step is the documentation and analysis of the current state. So what's the current state? What do I mean by that? The current state is a description of your business processes as they exist today. Everyone is using some form of a formal system. It is this formal system which we want to document and evaluate. This activity should be done with the company's business process experts. On the next few slides, I'm going to show you some examples of documenting the current state. This first list is the typical functions that we see in a manufacturing company. The processes cover all of the information functions we typically see in a manufacturer. So when we're talking about looking at the information system, we're not just looking at maybe just functionalities that just exist in the incumbent system. We're looking at all of the processes, Excel, Word, all of the business processes that exist within that manufacturing company.
You know, Jeff, when we look at this list, one of the words that comes to mind is silos. And it's something that we look at when we go into companies and ask them to describe themselves, and they list out these functions. And a function is a little bit different than a process. So what we really have here is a list of functions, and I'll kind of build on that as we go ahead.
Thanks, Rich. Now I'm showing you typical functions we see in manufacturing. The processes cover all of the information functions we typically see in a manufacturer. We've got to organize these into groups. And Rich can comment on, these different groups of applications and what they mean.
So when we start looking at a company to really drive the improvement, we've got to look at how the processes integrate, or the functions integrate with each other into a process. So what we like to do is to first just understand what's the value stream within the company, and then which functions are contributing in what sequence to that value stream. And we'll organize those functions into major processes that we call things like quote to cash or order to cash. So within quote to cash, order to cash, we're issuing a quote, taking an order, making the delivery, collecting the cash. Within procure to pay, how do we know what to buy? What do we buy? How do we receive it? How do we pay for it? Right. So to deliver the compelling value, we've got to look at how these processes, these functions are working together in terms of an integrated process or not working. And so that's what we're trying to do with this level 0, is just at a high level, what's the business model and how are the functions integrated into these processes or not integrated?
This next slide shows us what we call a supply chain map. This map helps us understand how the company operates with its suppliers and customers.
Yeah, so here, the more complex the supply chain, either in terms of diversity of supply or the more complex in terms of the number of customer types and or distribution channels, the more complexity there is in the business. So we've got to look at not just the inside of the company, but how they fit in the ecosystem of the supply chain to see what kind of dependencies and what types of business scenarios are being inflicted into the company, either from the suppliers or what type of requirements are coming forth based on the distribution channels and customer types.
Lastly, I'm going to show you an inventory of all business processes. Think of this as a table of contents for all of the maps and diagrams of the business processes within the company. As I mentioned before, we're looking beyond just the incumbent system. We're looking at all business processes, regardless of whether it's the legacy system or whether it's a departmental system. We need to pull it all together and start to look at it and dissect it and analyze it as a whole set of business processes for the company, so that we can evaluate it as to its fit to best practices in the industry.
So out in the public domain are standardized process models in terms of, as you look at a company and how the company is described within these major processes like quote to cash or procure to pay, there are a subset of processes that are a standard model. And we've taken that within Ultra and have adapted it and expanded on it based on our targets into manufacturing and distribution. But the idea is that we want to take these sub processes and map them into which systems are being used to execute those processes, and to the degree that those systems are enabling us to jump across those functional silos, the better. Where they're inhibiting, that's important to understand too. And all this ultimately is going to come together in terms of how do we drive value in the company.
On this next chart, I've got a list of business functions, and we've shown you a couple of different variations of that. But what I want to point out to you is that as time has gone on and ERP systems have evolved, there is something that I call core ERP. Orders, purchase orders, work orders, inventory movements, deliveries, invoices, etc. But on the next chart, what you see is a more integrated look. And this is where systems have evolved over time. So we're going to dissect this for a few minutes. I want to look at these particular pieces. What we've seen is the integration of what we'll call CRM, and I'll explain that in a minute, WMS, MES, PLM with finance and supply chain. So let's look at these different ellipses and the different components that are within these, and kind of describe some of the issues that you have. So on the left, we see SCM, and that stands for supply chain management. And that's where you have the forecasting, the advanced planning, your typical MRP and MPS type applications. To the right, you see CRM, and more systems now have complete CRM systems integrated with what we used to call core ERP. And in CRM, of course, you've got Salesforce automation, contact management, telemarketing, and e-commerce has evolved. And as you see some customer-facing applications such as configurators, customer service, and different functions in that particular area. And then we get into the WMS, the warehouse management system. We see shipping and receiving and inventory control, barcoding, and the logistics applications. We see on the left the FMS, the finance management systems. And a couple of new things that you may or may not be aware of is that the advancement of what we call PLM, or product lifecycle management, which is designed to enable engineering business processes. And then MES, which is manufacturing execution systems. And when we talk about Internet of Things, this is the typical area where we see a lot of that activity, where we get machines talking to the ERP systems. So this is what you're going to see as eventually companies wanting to move to a completely integrated system, really covering all of the advanced applications within a typical manufacturing business.
So when we look at improvements and evolutions of business models, in particular, like with our manufacturing base, quite often we're seeing companies that wish to go more of a direct-to-consumer route in addition to their traditional, 1-2-step distribution models. And as they do that, and you look at, say, the quote to cash process, and just kind of think that through, how a customer is informed of a price through e-commerce, how you take an order, ship an order, is dramatically different than how you would do that with a more traditional distribution model. And so then when you look at the breakdown of systems within companies, we'll quite often see like one e-commerce system interacting with another system, which is taking an order, and then a warehouse management system, which is shipping the order. So as all this stuff is coming together into a kind of a common platform, the easier it is to adopt some of these innovative business models. But e-commerce still, to be frank, is lagging out there in terms of roll-up, and we're seeing a lot of work, a lot of opportunity for growth, but at the same time, a lot of requirements for business change around e-com.
So let me address the question of why analyze your current state. I've had a lot of vendors particularly kind of take issue with me on some of these things. Let's just go right to the future state. Well, my answer is that if you don't understand the current state, how can you possibly create the proper future state for the business. But in looking at the current state, it's very important to look at that, to understand the issues and the opportunities, to address the needs for change, to inventory all of the processes and data, and to compare it to best practices. And while doing that, we have typically, in comparing it best practices, used something we call the business process maturity model. To introduce that concept, I'd like Rich to talk about the business process maturity model.
So we've talked about the quote to cash and the procure to pay and the plan to produce. So these like major processes. But when you look at the process, there's a doing it well, doing it okay, or doing it poorly kind of a continuum on these processes. But we need some kind of a definition of what is really good for quote to cash, what is really good for procure to pay, and how much benefit is there to achieve that, right? So to go from not very good to extremely good for a particular process, there's an investment that's required, and there's a value to that. And so what we're about is trying to get these high-level quote to cash, procure to pay processes broken down into some descriptive models that we can then compare our clients to and say, here's the gap, and not just tell me what you think you can improve, and this is what we think can improve. We want to look at it from comparing it to a prescriptive model. And it's interesting, as you break it down, we can actually score it, and we use something called the CMMI model, which you can find in Lean Six Sigma. But that CMMI model, we actually will go through and break down quote to cash, procure to pay, and actually kind of rank from a 1 to a 5 scale each of the elements of quote to cash, procure to pay, design, deploy, and feed that back to, so say you're looking at a company from an acquisition perspective, we'll actually give you a score in terms of what is the maturity level in each of these processes, so that you can understand what investments would be need to be made to improve the capability, and what's the corresponding business case around that. So out in Lean Six Sigma is this capability maturity model, and we've actually kind of built that out for quote to cash, order to procure to pay, et cetera. And it starts at the real basic level of level 1, and this is again the Lean Six Sigma definition, but level 1 ad hoc. These are where processes are unpredictable, poorly controlled, and reactive to managed, where we're getting a little bit better understanding, and we actually have well-defined. And by and large, the majority of the clients that we go in to help fall kind of in this level 2 with a little bit of level 1, occasionally up into level 3. It's pretty rare that we see level 5 type of processes in terms of dramatic investment in technology, continuous improvement, and just really cutting edge capabilities. Where organizations are doing these, they tend to be industry leaders. So for example, we have a client that does aftermarket truck accessories. And as we went in, we actually did a high level capability assessment with them. And we broke it down into not just the processes like we're talking about, but also leadership, culture, and technology. And if you think about it in terms of looking at a potential transaction, this is potentially a way to kind of look at that in terms of how mature is the leadership, how mature are the processes, how mature is the culture, how mature is the technology. And in this case, they were in pretty good shape from a leadership perspective, process, culture, technology, pretty typical where we would see things around a 2. And so then the idea is that we had a conversation with the management team, and all this went into much more detail than I'm going to show you here, but we had conversations with the management team in terms of which of these areas do you really want to make a meaningful investment through this transformation, and what target do you want to get to? And so we worked with them in terms of, so today, for example, your leadership team, we're categorizing it as a 2. What would be required to get it up to a level 3? And we broke that down into, well, let's talk about the business plan, vision, and strategy. That was fairly immature. The executive commitment was there, but more of a lip service than putting action behind it, and they needed a lot of work to do in terms of bringing in and building up a project management capability. So we viewed these as kind of the critical success factors within leadership. Then we looked at their processes, and I've talked about that a little bit in terms of that CMMI process model, and we actually broke this down to another level and gave them a score around their procure to pay, plan to produce, et cetera. And for the most part, their processes were documented, but they were siloed. So they had systems that were supporting specific functions within the process, but they weren't well connected. And so their master files were kind of a mess. And there was a lot of kind of a batch orientation to the company, which resulted in delays in terms of being able to access information, to be able to push up customer service capabilities. And they didn't really even know how well they were doing because their key performance measures were kind of ad hoc and inconsistently applied across the processes. So again, the transformation plan was to basically improve through the process that Jeff talked about of doing a current state, going through an envisioning exercise, defining a future state, but also transforming the business to look at it from a process management perspective. So let's look at procure to pay as a unit instead of purchasing as a unit, receiving as a unit, accounts payable as a unit. Let's set up KPIs around those integrated processes and start to adopt more of a process management framework than just a straight siloed functional framework. And then to take them through this kind of a transformation, because that is a pretty substantial change to look at things from a business process management perspective versus a functional, we needed to make sure that we understood the culture, the management, and where they were at. And for the most part, the company had kind of an awareness with a little bit of a modest general understanding. And so what we needed to do was to put in place a change management strategy to take them kind of through this curve and to aggressively manage that throughout the transformation. So culture maturity, and so we've got a good description in terms of what culture maturity looks like. In this case, they had multiple failures to change in the past, and with that failure to change, that creates kind of some angst and some apprehension to the change. Again, so we appointed some business process owners, super business process owners, procure to pay, plan to produce, process owners that then needed to articulate the expectation across the functions to get everybody on board to move ahead. So change, adoption, communication, education, training were all factors. And then lastly, to achieve a meaningful transformation in the company, we needed to assess the IT environment. And here they were pretty problematic in a lot of areas, very, very reactive, didn't have good standardized operational procedures within IT. Their IT governance was poor. And this was an area that they really needed to make some substantial investments in an aggressive way to get them to where they needed to be. So kind of thinking ahead, as you go in to assess improvement opportunities within an organization, you want to look at it across each of these dimensions and come up with a maturity score, and then try to quantify what's the value of moving from a 1 to a 2 or a 2 to a 3, so that you can appropriately build a business case and channel investments. So throughout all this, master data is extremely important, in particular when you've got situations where we're putting multiple companies together, or on the flip side, we're going to need to carve out companies. So I'm going to talk about a business case in which 2 companies were pulled together and they were selling into a common set of customers. But to achieve all the to market strategies that were identified during the due diligence and acquisition, they needed to move to a common item master and a common customer master, so that their customers viewed them as one entity and not 2. And so that's a lot of work. And the larger the SKU counts, the larger the customer counts, that's a whole set of investments that's not always in particular looked at, but it ends up being a real bear to get your arms around. So having a maturity score on the IT on the data master data files is real important as well. So some real world examples. So we had a client that was actually two companies that were brought together in the waste handling industry. Company one provided service and parts for the truck chassis, and company two provided parts and service, et cetera, for the compactor units and all the things that go in the back. And so it was a common set of customers, in this case, waste handling businesses, in which the companies needed to rationalize disparate systems and come up with a joint to-market strategy, eliminate redundancies, and just really kind of achieve the value that was rationalized in terms of moving forward with the transaction. And some heavy commitments were made to the customer base along those lines. So as Jeff mentioned, we did a current state analysis, went through, had extensive conversations with the management team, and made sure that we had the change management and alignment that we needed, created a project charter, defined a future state, and then from there rolled out where it made sense, a common system, and pulled together common services where it made sense, as well as ensuring that we maintained local responsiveness, et cetera. There was changes that were made in terms of commingling warehouses. So there was a whole range of things that we did. But to do that, one of the first things that we did was we created the level zeros like we showed you, and then organized those into processes. And then we looked at where there was overlap in activities between the two. So company A, we said, okay, here's the set of practices that we want to identify from a future state. How well would they apply to company B? And those ended up being a very high degree of overlap, and were kind of color coded in. There were a few that didn't make sense to change in company A, and there were a few that didn't make sense to change in company B. But the idea was that we put together an overall scenario process model and color coded and identified what we wanted to merge together and what we wanted to keep separate. Throughout all this, we had to manage a bunch of divergency. One was a California culture, the other was a Midwest culture, very, very different. One was more of a big company, the other was kind of a private ownership. But we went through consolidated master files and took the steps that we needed to improve customer responsiveness. So we actually applied the maturity model within these processes and set up a transformation plan and drove through it to high degree of success. So values that were realized, lots of KPIs, transformation to a process management focus, and reduction in cost and improvement in responsiveness to the industry. The second venture was a situation where we worked with a company that wished to execute an exit strategy, and in this case, it was a little bit more straightforward. But the results are pretty dramatic. So again, we went through, created the maturity models across the set of processes, identified the transformation plan, and executed it. And what I'd like to point out here is that a lot of times when folks are looking at installing or implementing a new system, et cetera, they tend to focus in on the productivity increases. But by and large, in this day and age, companies are running pretty lean. We do see some productivity improvements, but the real value of the investments typically comes down to asset reduction, reducing inventory, providing better visibility to purchases to enable improvement in purchasing negotiations, better insight into product costs, and allowing you to better rationalize the product portfolios. Or to have better insight into sales, to be able to provide top line lift by properly focusing marketing dollars. Those are the things that really drive the value. Yes, there's a little bit of value in terms of the streamlining of the processes, but it's more the offshoot of that in terms of these other benefits. And that's really what we want to make a step towards understanding. So what is the benchmark within inventory, and how are we going to move it? So in this case, for this company, again, by applying a targeted improvement, we were able to reduce shipping process time by 35%. We improved shipping accuracy through improved order picking, et cetera, by 25%. We reduced finished goods on hand inventory by 10%. And all of that, frankly, came about through significant improvement in inventory accuracy. Moved them online to real-time perpetual with material handling equipment, et cetera, and dramatically improved it. So a substantial business case, and then from there, then the company executed their exit strategy and are now part of a portfolio. Okay, so the last example is a food processor. They actually make items that go into the snacking segment, chip and snacking segment. And this one started out with just moving them from, for the most part, level 1 processes up to level 2, 3. From there, that was correcting of the major deficiencies. We defined a future state roadmap, selected a new system, implemented that, and got the company to a reasonably good set of process maturities. That company was sold to a PE firm. And then we started working with the PE firm in terms of how to roll up additional competitors in the market to pull them together. So then we went through and we did a process maturity assessment on acquisition targets multiple times, ultimately identified one that made sense and fed that back to them. They then went through the acquisition. We then looked at the two companies in terms of how to achieve the rationalization and the rollout of common processes and systems in terms of best practices, and again, accomplished that in about 5 months. So to start, we said, let's go through and validate the strategy assumption that I just talked about in terms of, will this make sense in terms of putting these together? And then from there, made recommendations back to them in terms of how to move forward. So similar to the last company that I showed you, in this case, we identified those things that would be applicable in both companies, taking the best practices that had or improved practices, continuing to progress them in the first company, and then deciding which of those we were going to roll into the second company. Where did it make sense to move to more of a service center? Where did it make sense to leave it decentralized? We looked at the master data, laid all that out, and built the transformation plan to achieve the value. So I went through master data workshops, a lot of work around data cleansing, migrating that, building it, converting it, and taking them through a cutover, and quite successfully. So again, this was about a 5-month process, came up, focusing on all the things that I just talked about. So with that, Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, I think there's a lot of takeaways from the information that Rich was showing you and the processes that we used. We talked about what is the importance of business processes and the value of a company. We talked about how to go about doing a business process assessment. We talked about the business maturity model, which I think is a very interesting way for a potential acquirer to look at a business and look at the value of the information system, which is very important, obviously, in a value of a company. Not the only part, but it is a key part of the whole equation, the whole puzzle. And then we looked at some case studies and showed you some of the ways that we've addressed some acquisitions and mergers and divestitures. So think about those particular things that we showed you when you're thinking about evaluating a potential acquisition, or if you're looking at improving the performance of your existing portfolio, or if you're preparing a company for sale. Improving business performance by improving business processes. And lastly, how to benchmark your business process maturity. Now, what I'd like to do next is to just kind of close it out a little bit with a small information about some of the areas where you can find some more information. So Ultra has constructed a very vibrant website with a lot of thought leadership. So I wanted to point you to our website, ultraconsultants.com, where you're going to see a lot of information, case studies, webinars, and demos, white papers, surveys, and reports. So now I'd like to just open it up for some questions. We have some questions here. I wanted to pose the first question for Rich and ask Rich to explain what happens when you do these assessments of the business maturity and you come back with kind of a negative report, a 1 or a 2. What's the reaction of management?
Because of the rigor that we apply, a lot of times we're feeding back. It's the old saying that bad news is good information. I guess is how I would put it. So we tend to surface a lot of things because we're looking at things in sort of an integrated way that maybe not had necessarily been there. So there's depending on the culture maturity is sort of how things are received. But we're pretty good about delivering the news succinctly but compassionately. And through that process, once the management team kind of gets their arms around that this is an opportunity to improve versus a judgment, things tend to go really well.
Rich, how do you make the decisions on maturity level? What do you use as your yardstick or benchmark?
So for each of the major processes, so quote to cash, et cetera, we actually have written out descriptions in terms of what we would expect to see, as well as, you saw the list of processes. So the idea is that we're literally, it's an interview type of a thing that we're doing where we're looking for behaviors, we're looking for the degree that the systems are integrated. We're looking for different methods from a process perspective in terms of, so for example, on accounts payable, are you doing at receipt? Are you paying the invoice at receipt based on a trusted relationship? Or is it kind of the old style three-way match with kind of a delay, right? So what degree of trust is there? So there's just a whole series of questions that we're asking along each of those processes, and the same thing with technology, the same thing with culture. And based on that, we can kind of score it.
We have a question from Casey Fry, and Casey was asking the question, what is the time frame to complete a level 0 to level 2 evaluation?
It depends on the ability of who we're talking to dedicate to it. Typically, to go through that initial assessment is about 1 to 2 months in terms of elapsed time, with a resource commitment of a process team, right? So as we go in, what we've got to do is to really just identify the process team that's going to support this, and lay out the interview agenda and get that on their calendars, et cetera. And that typically, that whole process takes a couple of months.
Another question that came up here, what does that process team look like when you go into a manufacturing company? What are the people that you want to put in the room for this process?
We're looking for change agents. We'll call them the business process owners. So that, like, one of the interesting questions we ask first is, okay, so if you were to look at this major process, who in the company can be in a position to kind of provide oversight to that whole process and help weigh the trade-offs? And then we're looking for, within that process team, somebody to represent each of the major processes that we listed. So purchasing, receiving, accounts payable, right? So that will kind of be the three. So we're looking for a change agent from each of those. And those typically are managers, director level types, depending on the size of the company.
Okay, good. Those are the questions that I've seen so far. If the audience wants to submit some questions, please put them forward, and I'll pose them to myself or Rich. All right, well, Cassandra, I think we've run out of questions right now. So I want to thank everybody for attending today. Oh, I think I've got one more. It just came through.
2 more.
Yeah, so 2 more.
So I
For
can take,
co-owners,
yeah,
okay, you want to take the co-owners one? Okay.
yeah. So that gets back to change management, right? So how do you shake them loose where the owners are resistant to change? People resist change for a couple of reasons. They resist change because they don't feel that they can be successful, or they feel that there's something to lose. And so you've got to get into it from the perspective of calling out what's the reason behind the resistance. It's generally one of those two behaviors. And you have to kind of be transparent with what's going on and kind of build the education around that. If it's a capabilities issue, then we've got to address that. If it's a fear of losing something, we've got to kind of address that. There's a great book out there actually by a gentleman by the name of Cotter called Leading Change that I suggest that take a look at. When it's an owner, it gets a little bit stickier in that you don't have necessarily the authority or the legitimate, right? So they have the expertise and stuff. And so from that standpoint, there has to be a set of trade-offs, sometimes harsh.
Any other questions? Can we get a copy of the presentation? Yeah, you very much so. So I'll let Cassandra inform you as to how that information will be forthcoming. For due diligence on acquiring a lower mid-market company, how many consultants would you generally staff the engagement?
Yeah, so for a smaller 10 to 50 million, that would typically be a 2 to 3 person team. You know, we typically have somebody focusing in on the financial, somebody focusing on supply chain, and somebody focusing in on the IT.
Is there concern for owners planning to divest about selecting the wrong ERP system in the eyes of potential acquirers? That's an interesting question. I'll let you take that, Rich.
Okay. So there's kind of a couple of questions there really built into that. So when you're looking at a divestiture or a carve out, that whole master files question, right? So the more work that's going to be required to untangle is just as pertinent as like what I was showing, which is the amount of work to put things together. So if the ultimate idea is that we want to carve it out and you want to make it attractive, you've got to be able to make it easy to take the stuff, the information, structures, et cetera, on the carve out and make that more of a standalone so that it's easier to pull out to push the value up. We've worked with companies where that was not easy, and it was really under the gun in terms of like, how are we going to get them off the legacy systems and stuff within the time frames that the deal was going to go through, and it added a lot of drag on the transaction, because at some point the company that divested has got to be able to shake loose from it, and I think, well, when we're looking at it, the value is less in the name of the technology per se than it is in terms of the maturity and the ability of that system to integrate and the ability of that system to support decisions and to facilitate transactions. There might be a little bit of an impact, but for us, the maturity scale and the attractiveness to the acquisition of divestiture is based more on how mature the process is, how mature are their systems, and their ability to access the data. If all that's in good shape, the ability to migrate off of one system to another is not as big a deal. So that's a better way to look at the impact on evaluation versus is it SAP or Oracle or Epicor or Infor or whatever.
I was just going to add to that your comments, Rich. We've got a client that just had contacted us, and they had been considering a new ERP system for a number of years and had constantly come up to that question annually and continuously decided not to do it. Now the ownership has decide to sell the company. But they've asked for a report on what a potential new system would be that they could show to a potential acquirer. So that's another interesting aspect to that particular question. So here's another question. We're always vendor neutral in our analysis and recommendations. Can you talk a bit about how you see the ERP landscaping evolving? Is SAP still state of the art? What about smaller vendors? What about cloud ERP? Those are great questions. So I'll let Rich jump in, and then I'll add some color to it also.
So SaaS is now comprising probably 50% of the selections and implementations that we're working through. The resistance to that is really kind of melted away as bandwidth continues to improve and as a reliability of information networks continues to improve. Believe it or not, Amazon Web Services, AWS, is one of the largest, if not the largest, hosting provider because of all that phenomenon. Because the challenge, right, with SaaS products, et cetera, is how do you get the information in and out in a streamlined and rapid way? And I talked about like the e-com and how all that pulls together. And so what we're starting to see is a lot more consolidation within these super data centers, Azure and Google, et cetera, right? So these are all kind of coming together to be more of like a platform and hosting that stuff. So that's kind of more of the state of the art. The on-prem stuff in large organizations is still, I think, a good appetite, but in the smaller companies, more and more we're seeing that drive into the SaaS. SAP is state of the art from the perspective of enabling substantial business practices. The SAP model is one in which you're going to configure to the system to fit the company as others, but the breadth of that functionality is quite large. And so from that standpoint, I don't think there's really anybody out there that has the breadth of functionality to configure. And so when you go into large organizations, it's a great fit from that perspective.
I want to just comment on the beginning of that question. What are your thoughts on your favorite ERP? We attack the marketplace by vertical industry. What I mean by that is that process is different than discrete. Making an industrial equipment is different than making food or beverages or chem or pharma. The auto industry is different than the aerospace industry. Consumer product goods have different issues with large retailers than med device companies have with hospitals or the government and remuneration, et cetera. So when you look at it by vertical industry, you see distinct functional differences. The core is the same. They all need orders. They all need purchase orders. They all need manufacturing orders. They all need scheduling, blah, 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 as you go through it. So the core is the same, but there are variations in the applications based on those industries. So we focus exclusively on manufacturing and distribution because that gives us a huge market that we need to analyze by vertical industry to understand it and understand where it's going. So we don't want to get clouded with other industries. We just want to focus on being the best of that. But what we've done is we've now attacked those industries and said, okay, what are those key decision drivers in those industries that direct us to the most popular and the best vendor for that industry? So we now are doing research by industry and then by vendor by industry to basically understand the capabilities that they offer and how much play do they have in that particular industry. Who has the most presence in automotive? Well, there isn't any one guy out there, but who has the best solution for automotive for particular requirements? So that's kind of the way we look at it. So in that sense, you don't necessarily have a favorite. You have several vertical industries, and within those industries, you have favorites. Now we are seeing, and there is also kind of on, and I've been in this industry, my whole business career. I was at, I had my own software company, and then I had built a services company. And I've always been working with ERP vendors, and they always evolve over time. And there was a time when SAP was very dominant. Then Bond came into the marketplace. Oracle came into the marketplace. JD Edwards was very, very popular. So, today we're seeing this NetSuite product become very popular. We see some smaller companies like Plex that are SaaS products, and Rootstock emerge as real good competitors in the mid-market space. So there's a lot of choices. And so I don't see any, when we add up at our counts at the end of the year in terms of how many selections that we did and what vendor won the most, it's pretty evenly split. And a lot of it is where you see any dominance, it might be in a vertical industry. Did you see any other questions come through, Rich?
Yeah, so there's a question from Dan asking, is a cloud implementation any easier than an in-house implementation or on-prem implementation or setup? There's definitely a big difference in the first part of the project in terms of spinning up a system that you can get your hands on, because there's no real install, right? So within the SaaS, it's basically you're going to get a subscription, you get a browser-based setup. So getting all the infrastructure squared away on a straightforward implementation with minimal interfaces, et cetera, is I think probably easier. On the flip side, the integration, as you get into high volume interfaces, you have to kind of watch that. That can get a little bit more complex, just because of the data throughputs and the choke points on the internet. The implementation methodologies are pretty similar from how do you test out the system, validate it, configure it, and support it. The way that enhancements and changes are dealt with is a little bit different between the two. The costs between the two, it's a fairly complex model that you have to go through to make sure that you get all the costs really rolled in to be able to compare the two. It's not just the cost of the software or the subscriptions, because there's differences in infrastructure setups, the amount of internal resources required to support it. And so like from a strategy perspective, as you look at a company, something that's going to be a rapid turn could have a very different value component to it in SaaS versus an on-prem with a longer term horizon, right? So it's all these factors kind of got to come together as you decide whether SaaS or on-prem makes sense. But overall, I would say the industry is trending towards SaaS as networks become more reliable and as bandwidth becomes approaching infinity.
We have a question that came in that is there any value in involving a technology vendor during the current state and future state reviews? And I'll just comment on that first and then ask Rich to comment. As I showed you, one of the things that we do is a lot of current state analysis. But the next step in our process is educate. So we take a great deal of effort to take that business team of business process owners when we're going through what we call a business process improvement or business process review phase. Because what we want to do is take that core team. They're always very knowledgeable on what their current state is, but they're not very knowledgeable on best practices today. So we want to educate them during this process on best practices. What's the best way to do that is by showing them demonstrations of best practices from the vendors. So we have a complete library of all of those business processes and many different vendors' approaches to best practices in a particular functional area of the business. So we do involve the technology vendor. We don't want to do it in an evaluation setting yet because we don't have the future state designed. Once we complete that future state, that's where we generally move into the technology evaluation process. Rich, did you want to comment on that at all?
No, that was good, Jeff.
Okay. Any other questions you see?
Mm-mm.
I see we're running running low on
A
time.
reliable, independent source of who are the key software vendors by an industry vertical. Yeah, we'll be happy to work with you.
I don't think so. So I think because we focus so much. I think we do more of these than anybody else, and as an organization, we're really intense about being the best at the knowledge base. So I think we'd have a lot to offer for you in that regard. Anyway, thank you very much, and I want to turn it back to Cassandra to close everything out. Thank you.